Tasha had been working at the Golden Fork, a luxurious restaurant in the heart of the city, for just over a year. She was proud of the job, her first step toward independence after graduating from college. The restaurant was well known for its high-end menu, elegant ambience, and clientele. People came from all over just to have a taste of the renowned dishes prepared by the celebrity chef, Gordon Morrow. The staff wore crisp uniforms, and everyone was expected to deliver top-tier service, no matter who walked through the door. On this particular evening, the restaurant was busier than usual. It was the kind of night when the air hummed with energy, the clinking of silverware, the chatter of satisfied customers, and the sizzling sounds from the kitchen. Tasha moved between tables with precision, her feet never slowing as she refilled glasses, wiped down surfaces, and greeted guests. She had mastered the art of managing multiple tables without breaking a sweat, even when the restaurant was full. But tonight, something felt different. As she passed a corner table, she overheard whispers. "It's him. Richard Caldwell," one man whispered to his companion, excitement in his voice. Tasha had heard of him, of course. Richard Caldwell, the billionaire CEO of Caldwell Enterprises, was a name that everyone in the business world knew. He had built his company from the ground up, and now it was one of the most successful corporations in the world. He was a self-made man, but his reputation was a mix of admiration and fear. He was ruthless in business, and many said he treated employees and clients like tools to be used until they were no longer needed. Tasha felt the shift in the atmosphere as the door to the private dining room opened. Richard Caldwell entered, flanked by a group of well-dressed men and women who immediately filled the room with an aura of power and importance. His sharp suit and cold demeanor made him stand out even more than the others. He was tall, with perfectly combed silver hair and a look that could stop conversations. His eyes, dark and calculating, swept the room, seemingly scanning for potential weaknesses. As Tasha continued serving drinks, she noticed him settling into a chair with his companions, his eyes flickering from one face to another, but never stopping long enough to connect with anyone. She had seen many powerful people come through those doors, but there was something about Richard Caldwell that unsettled her. It was the way he carried himself, the way the world seemed to revolve around him, as if no one dared to challenge his authority. Tasha took a deep breath. It wasn't her place to judge. Her job was to make sure everyone had what they needed, no matter who they were. She approached the table with a warm smile, careful to make her presence known but not intrusive. "Good evening. May I take your drink orders?" she asked, her voice steady. Richard Caldwell didn't acknowledge her immediately. Instead, he turned his attention to the menu in front of him, his finger tracing the descriptions of the dishes with an air of disinterest. After a long moment, he finally looked up, his eyes scanning her from head to toe in a way that made her feel small. "Water," he said abruptly. "For all of us. And make sure it's the best, none of that tap nonsense." Tasha nodded, trying not to let the sharpness in his tone faze her. She had encountered plenty of rude customers in the past, but something about this man's attitude felt different. It was more than just a request, it was an expectation, an order that carried an undertone of superiority. "Of course, sir," she replied politely, quickly moving to the next table to grab the water glasses. She had to focus. There were other customers to attend to, other tables that needed refilling and cleaning. But every now and then, she could feel Richard Caldwell's gaze on her, like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. When she returned to deliver the water, he was talking loudly to the people at his table, his voice carrying across the room. Tasha had heard his name mentioned before, in the news and around the office. He was famous for his sharp business acumen and his willingness to do whatever it took to stay on top. But now, in person, he seemed to exude an arrogance that made Tasha's stomach churn. As she placed the water on the table, she accidentally brushed her hand against Richard's arm. It was a minor mistake, something that could have happened to anyone, but Richard's reaction was swift and harsh. He jerked his arm away, glaring at her with disdain. "Watch where you're touching, girl," he snapped. His words were low enough that only she could hear, but they carried an unmistakable sting. Tasha's heart skipped a beat. She had heard that Richard Caldwell had a reputation for being difficult, but she didn't expect this, especially not in front of his guests. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that she was just doing her job, that she wasn't here to argue or fight. She bit her lip and apologized, keeping her voice as calm as she could manage. "I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't mean to." Richard cut her off, his voice turning even more condescending. "You didn't mean to? Well, maybe you should pay attention to what you're doing, then. It's not difficult to serve drinks without bumping into people." Tasha stood there, frozen for a moment, the color rising to her cheeks. She could feel the eyes of the others at the table on her now, their gazes shifting uncomfortably. She had no idea what to say. She had encountered rude customers before, but nothing like this. Nothing so deliberate, so cold. "Sorry, sir," she muttered, quickly turning to walk away. She kept her head down as she moved through the restaurant, trying to shake off the sting of the interaction. But it was hard. His words echoed in her mind, each one like a slap across her face. She tried to convince herself that it didn't matter, that it was just one rude customer. But the more she thought about it, the angrier she became. Back in the kitchen, Tasha took a few moments to steady herself. She tried to focus on her work, but her hands shook slightly as she prepared another order. It wasn't just the insult that bothered her, it was the realization that someone could treat her that way, just because they felt they could. She had worked so hard to get here, to prove her worth. But all it took was one arrogant man to make her feel invisible. She took a deep breath and pushed those thoughts aside. She couldn't let it get to her. She had a job to do. Tasha returned to the dining area, focusing on the next set of orders, but she couldn't help glancing over at Richard's table every now and then. His entourage was laughing now, no longer paying attention to her. Richard, however, was still staring at her, his cold eyes watching her every move. Tasha refused to meet his gaze. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction. She would do her job, no matter how unpleasant the situation had become. But deep down, she felt a simmering frustration, a sense that something had to change. She just didn't know yet what that change would look like, or how it would come. The evening dragged on, and the atmosphere in the restaurant remained tense. Tasha tried her best to push the encounter with Richard Caldwell to the back of her mind, but every time she passed by his table, the memories of his rude words crept back into her thoughts. She had always prided herself on staying calm under pressure, but tonight, something was different. Every time she glanced over at Richard's table, she saw his sharp eyes following her, and it sent a cold shiver down her spine. As she walked by the table again to check on another customer, she heard one of Richard's associates laughing loudly, a sound that only made her feel more invisible. They were talking about some business venture or investment, their voices filled with the kind of authority and self-importance that made Tasha feel like she was merely a background figure in their world. But it was the way they looked at her, like she was nothing more than a servant, that made her stomach turn. The restaurant was full of important people, but this was different. This wasn't just another rich person, this was Richard Caldwell, a man who had shaped industries, built an empire, and commanded respect at the highest levels. Tasha clenched her jaw and forced herself to focus. She couldn't afford to let her emotions get in the way of her work. But the more she tried to push the feeling away, the more it lingered. She didn't want to let it affect her, but it was hard not to. At one point, as she was walking past the kitchen door to check on an order, she overheard a conversation between two of her coworkers. Jordan, who was working as a busboy that night, was standing near the kitchen, talking to Mia, a fellow waitress who had been working at the restaurant even longer than Tasha. Did you see the way he treated her? Jordan asked, his voice full of disbelief. That guy's a jerk. No one should talk to anyone like that. Mia sighed, shaking her head. Yeah, I saw it. But you know how it goes. People like him think they can do whatever they want. They think they're above everyone else, especially people like us. I don't care how rich he is, Jordan said, his voice firm. It's just disrespectful. No one should get away with treating people like that. Tasha stood still for a moment, hidden just behind the kitchen door. She could hear the anger in their voices, but she also heard something else: sympathy. They were on her side, and for a brief moment, it made her feel better. It was nice to know that someone else had seen what happened and recognized it for what it was. Still, she didn't want to make a big deal out of it. It was just one rude person, right? She had dealt with difficult customers before. It wasn't worth causing a scene. Tasha stepped back into the dining area, her mind still swirling with thoughts of what had happened. As she passed the table where Richard and his entourage were seated, she couldn't help but overhear his voice again, now raised, commanding. If this isn't the best steak in the city, I'll be asking for a discount. And make sure it's done just right. You know how I like it? His words were clear, his tone full of entitlement. Tasha felt a pang of frustration. It wasn't that she couldn't handle rude customers, it was that Richard Caldwell wasn't just another rude customer. He was someone who could ruin someone's day with just a few words. He was someone who had so much power that he could crush someone's dreams without even thinking about it. And that bothered her. She focused on her work, determined not to let him get under her skin. She took orders, refilled drinks, and checked on other guests, but in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling of being powerless. There was no denying it, Richard Caldwell had made her feel small. But that feeling of powerlessness was short-lived. Tasha had always been the kind of person who refused to stay in a bad situation for too long. She had dreams, goals, and a future that didn't involve being pushed around by people like Richard. She had worked hard to get to this point in her life, and she wasn't going to let one rude person make her feel like she wasn't worth something. Still, as the evening wore on, the words from Richard's table lingered in the air like smoke. The restaurant had emptied out a little, but Richard and his entourage remained, finishing their meal. Tasha was almost done for the night, but she couldn't help but glance over at their table once more. Richard's voice, sharp and cold, rang out again. I expect better service next time, he said, barely glancing at Tasha. This is unacceptable. Tasha took a deep breath. She had been working for hours, staying professional despite his behavior, but this was the last straw. The way he spoke to her, the way he made her feel, she couldn't ignore it any longer. She walked toward the back of the restaurant, where Mr. Thompson, the restaurant manager, was standing by the office door. He was talking to another employee, but Tasha could see the frustration in his face. She had seen him deal with difficult customers before, but tonight seemed different. Mr. Thompson, she said, her voice a little shaky but determined, I need to talk to you about something. Mr. Thompson looked up, sensing the seriousness in her tone. What is it, Tasha? She hesitated for a moment. She had always been the type to keep her head down and just do her job, but tonight, something inside her had shifted. It's about Richard Caldwell, she said, her voice growing more confident. He insulted me. In front of his whole table. I didn't say anything at the time, but I can't just let it go. It's not right. Mr. Thompson didn't respond right away. He stood there for a moment, as if processing what she had said. Tasha could tell that he didn't want to get involved. After all, Richard Caldwell was a big deal, a billionaire with connections everywhere. But Tasha wasn't asking for special treatment. She just wanted to be treated with respect. I understand, Tasha, Mr. Thompson said finally, his voice quieter than usual. "I'll handle it. Don't worry about it. You did the right thing." But even as he spoke those words, Tasha wasn't sure if she felt any better. She wasn't asking for someone to handle it for her. She just wanted to be seen, to be heard. Tasha returned to her station, her mind racing. She still had one more table to attend to before her shift ended, but something had changed inside her. She wasn't going to let this go, not without standing up for herself. Whatever happened next, she was done letting people like Richard make her feel less than she was. It wasn't just about the insult anymore, it was about her worth, her dignity. The next morning, Tasha woke up feeling more determined than ever. She had spent most of the night tossing and turning, replaying the events of the previous evening over and over in her head. The more she thought about Richard Caldwell's behavior, the angrier she became. She had always known that some people were arrogant, but his treatment of her had crossed a line. It wasn't just the words he had said, it was the way he had made her feel invisible, as if she didn't even matter. But Tasha knew she couldn't let it go. She had to stand up for herself, not just for her own sake, but for anyone who had ever been made to feel small by someone with power. She wasn't going to let Richard's behavior slide. Not this time. By the time Tasha had finished her morning coffee and gotten dressed for work, she had made up her mind. She wasn't going to keep quiet about what had happened. She had already decided that she was going to report Richard to the restaurant manager, Mr. Thompson, but she had no idea what would come of it. She had heard stories of people with power getting away with things like this, and part of her was nervous. Richard Caldwell wasn't just any customer, he was a billionaire, the kind of person who could make or break a business with a single phone call. But Tasha wasn't afraid anymore. She had worked too hard to let someone like Richard take away her dignity. She wasn't going to let fear stop her from doing what was right. As she arrived at the Golden Fork, the restaurant was already bustling with activity. The lunch rush was in full swing, and the kitchen was working overtime to keep up with orders. Tasha didn't have much time to dwell on the incident from the night before, she had to focus on her job. But even as she filled drink orders and greeted customers, she couldn't shake the thought of Richard. The hours passed quickly, but Tasha couldn't forget the way he had made her feel. It wasn't just about him, it was about everyone who had ever been treated poorly by someone who thought they were above the rules. Tasha didn't want to be just another person who let things slide. She didn't want to let the behavior of one person, no matter how powerful, define her. Then, just before the dinner rush began, Tasha saw something that stopped her in her tracks. She was walking through the restaurant when she spotted a familiar face at the front entrance. It was Lucia Grant, a well-known journalist who had written several articles about corporate corruption and social justice. Tasha had seen her on TV a few times, and she knew that Lucia was someone who wasn't afraid to take on powerful people. Lucia was speaking with the host at the entrance, and Tasha couldn't help but overhear part of the conversation. "I've heard a lot about the CEO of Caldwell Enterprises recently," Lucia said, her voice low but sharp. "It seems there's been some controversy surrounding his behavior. I'm interested in speaking with some of the employees who've had interactions with him." Tasha felt her heart race. She knew that this was her chance. This was the opportunity she had been waiting for. Lucia Grant was someone who could make a real difference, someone who could help shine a light on Richard Caldwell's behavior. Tasha had no idea what would happen if she spoke up, but she knew one thing: if she didn't take this chance, she would regret it forever. Tasha approached the entrance cautiously, not sure if she should even speak up. But something inside her told her this was the right moment. She cleared her throat and stepped forward. "Excuse me, Miss Grant," she said, her voice hesitant but firm. Lucia turned to face her, her eyes sharp and attentive. "Yes?" she asked, her tone curious. Tasha took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I work here," she said, gesturing to the restaurant. I was serving Richard Caldwell last night, and I just wanted to say that he was disrespectful. He insulted me in front of his entire group, and I didn't know what to do. Lucia's eyes softened, and she nodded. I see. That's unacceptable. Thank you for speaking up. It's important that people like him are held accountable for their actions. Tasha felt a wave of relief wash over her. She hadn't expected Lucia to be so understanding, but her response made her feel heard, like her voice actually mattered. They talked for a few more minutes, and Lucia asked Tasha for more details about the incident. Tasha shared everything she could remember: the way Richard had looked at her, the sharpness of his words, the way he had dismissed her like she was nothing. I'm going to write about this, Lucia said after a while. You've done the right thing, Tasha. People need to hear about what happened, and maybe it will start a bigger conversation about the way people like Richard Caldwell treat those who serve them. Tasha felt a sense of empowerment she hadn't experienced before. It was one thing to stand up for herself in the moment, but to know that someone like Lucia Grant believed her, that she was willing to take on someone like Richard, made all the difference. After their conversation, Lucia left the restaurant, but Tasha's mind was racing. She had done it, she had spoken up, and now, something was happening. She didn't know what the outcome would be, but she felt a sense of hope that she hadn't felt the night before. Maybe this wasn't just about one insult. Maybe, just maybe, this was a chance for things to change. Later that evening, as Tasha was finishing her shift, she overheard other employees talking about the article. It had been published that afternoon. Lucia Grant had written a piece that exposed Richard Caldwell's treatment of Tasha, and it had gone viral almost instantly. The headline read, "Billionaire CEO insults waitress, loses $5 billion deal in the aftermath." The article went on to describe the way Richard had behaved toward Tasha, how his actions had sparked outrage across the internet, and how people were now questioning his leadership. Tasha's phone buzzed with notifications. Her social media feed was flooded with messages of support. Friends, family, even strangers were sending messages of encouragement, telling her how brave she was. People were sharing the article, commenting on how wrong it was for someone with so much power to treat others like that. The support felt overwhelming, but it also felt good. It felt right. But the best part? Globaltech Industries, one of the companies that had been in talks with Caldwell Enterprises for a major deal, had just announced that they were pulling out. They cited the article, and the public backlash, as the reason for their decision. The $5 billion deal was off the table, and Richard's reputation had taken a huge hit. Tasha couldn't believe it. She had expected nothing to change, but now, she was seeing the consequences of Richard's actions unfold in real time. It felt like justice, but it was just the beginning. She knew there was more to come, and maybe this was the start of a bigger movement. Richard Caldwell may have thought he could get away with anything, but Tasha was proving him wrong. The days that followed Tasha's encounter with Richard Caldwell felt like a whirlwind. What started as a painful and humiliating experience had quickly escalated into something much bigger. The article written by Lucia Grant had gone viral, spreading across news outlets, social media platforms, and even corporate boardrooms. People from all walks of life were discussing the way Richard had treated her, and the world was watching to see what would happen next. For Tasha, the attention was overwhelming. At first, she was hesitant to read the thousands of messages that poured in. Her phone buzzed constantly with notifications from people she didn't know, sending their support and admiration. She had always kept a low profile, and the sudden attention felt like a double-edged sword. But as the days passed, she began to see the positive side. She received messages not only from strangers but from people in the service industry who had experienced similar treatment from powerful individuals. Many told her they had been too afraid to speak up, but seeing Tasha take a stand had inspired them. Some even shared their own stories, recounting how they had been disrespected by customers who felt entitled to treat them badly. The more she read, the more she realized that this wasn't just about her, it was about something much larger. It was about the power of speaking out against unfair treatment, no matter who the person on the other side was. Meanwhile, the fallout from the article continued to spread. Richard Caldwell had been under fire from multiple angles. His public relations team was working overtime to contain the damage, but the more they tried to spin the story, the worse it became. Globaltech Industries, one of his most trusted partners, had officially pulled out of the $5 billion deal, citing his behavior as the reason. The deal had been in the works for months, and losing it was a blow that no one had anticipated. The news of the cancelled deal was everywhere. Business analysts and reporters were asking how someone like Richard could have made such a critical mistake. But Tasha knew what the real mistake had been. It wasn't just the deal, it was the way Richard had treated her and countless others. She had seen firsthand how someone's arrogance could destroy their career, and she couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction as the world began to take notice. In the days that followed, Tasha couldn't ignore the whispers in the restaurant. Many of the employees were talking about the article and the scandal surrounding Richard. Some were excited, others nervous. There was a mix of emotions, but most of the staff seemed to agree on one thing: they had never seen anything like this before. Miss Grant's article had turned the tables, and now, everyone was wondering how far the ripple effects would go. Tasha had a brief conversation with Mr. Thompson, the restaurant manager, who had been more reserved after the incident. He had told her that they had received pressure from corporate to distance themselves from Richard Caldwell, especially given the negative attention. While he hadn't outright blamed her for the fallout, it was clear that the situation had become a headache for the restaurant. "I'm just doing my job," Tasha had said when Mr. Thompson tried to speak to her about the matter. "I never expected anything like this." Mr. Thompson gave her a tight smile. "I know, Tasha. But I need to make sure we're handling this carefully. I'm sure you understand." Tasha nodded, but inside, she felt a sense of validation. What had started as a moment of frustration had turned into a movement, and she had played a part in it. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that what she had done wasn't just about standing up for herself, it was about standing up for everyone who had ever been mistreated and overlooked. As the week went on, Richard Caldwell's company continued to suffer. More business deals began to unravel, and his image took a hit. Articles continued to surface, detailing not just the incident with Tasha, but other questionable decisions Richard had made throughout his career. His reputation, once untouchable, was now a source of public ridicule. Tasha, on the other hand, had become something of a hero to many. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a symbol of courage and integrity, someone who had stood up to a powerful man and forced the world to listen. She hadn't expected any of this to happen. She had simply wanted to be treated with respect, to stand up for herself in a moment when no one else was there to do it. But now, she was seeing the wider impact of her actions. One evening, after finishing her shift, Tasha was called into the office by Mr. Thompson. She wasn't sure what to expect. Part of her thought she might be reprimanded for causing a scene. Another part of her wondered if he was going to tell her that things were getting too complicated and that she might need to consider leaving the restaurant. But when she stepped into his office, she was surprised by what she found. Lucia Grant was sitting there, along with Jordan, one of the busboys, who had been talking to Tasha the night Richard had insulted her. They both smiled when they saw her. "Good to see you, Tasha," Lucia said, her voice warm and reassuring. "I wanted to talk to you about something. But first, I think you should know that the world has really taken notice of what you did." Tasha felt her heart race as Lucia continued. "Your story is being shared everywhere, and there's been a huge outpouring of support for you. People are calling you a role model for standing up for yourself." And I think that's something worth celebrating. Tasha blinked, surprised by how much attention she was getting. She hadn't expected this at all. It felt almost unreal to hear that she had become someone people admired. You deserve recognition for what you've done, Lucia continued. And I want to help you with that. Before Tasha could respond, Lucia handed her a small envelope. It contained an offer from a charity that supported workers in the service industry. They wanted to help Tasha pursue her dreams, offering her a scholarship to continue her education and training in hospitality management. The charity had been following her story and felt that she had the potential to make a big impact in the industry. Tasha sat there for a moment, stunned. This wasn't just a chance to take her career further, it was a chance to build something for herself, to take control of her future in a way she had never imagined. But as she sat there, looking at the offer, she realized something even more important. The world was changing. People were starting to recognize that those who worked in the background, the waiters, the cooks, the busboys, were just as valuable as those who sat at the top. Tasha had fought for respect, and now, it was coming back to her in ways she had never expected. As she left the office that evening, holding the scholarship offer in her hand, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had faced one of the most difficult challenges of her life, and now, it seemed that everything was falling into place. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was in control. Tasha knew that her story wasn't over yet. It was just the beginning. But one thing was clear: she had made a difference. And no matter what happened next, she was ready to keep fighting for what was right. The days following the scholarship offer felt surreal for Tasha. What started as a moment of frustration, a single act of standing up to someone who had insulted her, had snowballed into something beyond her wildest dreams. The world had changed, but not just for her. The powerful men and women who had always been untouchable, like Richard Caldwell, were now facing consequences for their actions. And Tasha, the waitress who had once felt invisible, was becoming a voice for many others. As the weeks went by, the media continued to cover the fallout from Richard's behavior. Stories about his arrogant treatment of employees, customers, and even partners filled news outlets. His company, Caldwell Enterprises, saw its stock price plummet, and more partnerships began to dissolve. What had once been a billion-dollar empire now looked like it was on the brink of collapse. It wasn't just the loss of the $5 billion deal with Globaltech Industries, it was the fact that people were finally seeing Richard for what he truly was. Tasha, however, wasn't paying as much attention to the news anymore. She had moved on from the scandal. There was too much going on in her own life for her to focus on the downfall of someone else. She had received an outpouring of support, not just from strangers online, but from her own community. Friends, family, and co-workers had congratulated her for speaking out, and the restaurant industry was slowly beginning to change. More and more people were willing to challenge the status quo, and Tasha had become a symbol of hope for those who felt powerless. It was something she never expected, but now, it felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. In the weeks that followed, Tasha decided to take the next step in her journey. She accepted the scholarship from the charity that had reached out to her, deciding to enroll in a hospitality management program. She had always loved the restaurant business, but she knew that there was more she could do. This was her chance to learn, grow, and eventually lead in an industry that often overlooked people like her. The first day of classes was exciting, though a little overwhelming. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she was ready to dive in. The program was challenging, but Tasha was determined to succeed. Her classmates came from different walks of life, but they shared a common goal: they wanted to make an impact in the hospitality world. For the first time in a long while, Tasha felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She didn't just want to be another face in the crowd. She wanted to lead, to make a difference, and to show the world that people like her, people who had been dismissed and overlooked, had something valuable to offer. Throughout her studies, Tasha stayed connected with her roots. She didn't forget where she came from, and she made sure to continue advocating for people in the service industry. She started attending community events and speaking at local forums about the importance of respect and dignity for workers. Her voice became stronger, and her message spread further than she ever thought possible. The more she spoke, the more people listened. Tasha was no longer just a waitress, she was an activist, an advocate for change. Back at the Golden Fork, her old workplace, things had also begun to change. The restaurant had received an influx of applications from people wanting to work there, inspired by Tasha's story. The employees, too, had started to feel more empowered. They had witnessed how one person's voice could make a difference, and they were eager to be part of a workplace that respected and valued them. Tasha still visited the restaurant from time to time, but now it was different. She wasn't just another employee. She was a symbol of what could happen when someone stood up for themselves, no matter how big or small the challenge. Mr. Thompson, the manager, had even given her a promotion to a supervisory role during her breaks from school. He told her that he admired her courage and wanted her to take on more responsibilities. Tasha's pride grew every time she walked through those doors. It wasn't just about making money anymore, it was about making an impact. But even as Tasha's life was moving forward, Richard Caldwell's downfall continued. He had tried to repair his image, offering public apologies and making donations to various causes. But the damage was already done. People had seen the true side of him, and there was no turning back. His company was losing investors left and right, and Richard himself had become a symbol of everything wrong with the powerful elite who thought they could get away with anything. As time passed, Richard Caldwell's story became a cautionary tale. It wasn't just about a billionaire losing a business deal, it was about the consequences of disrespect, arrogance, and entitlement. Tasha's actions had changed the conversation around power and privilege, and people were now paying attention. Richard's company, once a giant in the business world, was struggling to survive, while Tasha's journey was just beginning to gain momentum. One day, as Tasha was sitting in a cafe studying for an exam, she received a phone call that would change everything once again. It was from Lucia Grant, the journalist who had written the viral article about Richard. "Hello, Tasha," Lucia said, her voice filled with excitement. "I've got some incredible news for you." Tasha's heart skipped a beat. "What's going on?" she asked, curious. "I've been following your progress, and I've been in contact with a few people who are working on a book about workplace injustice," Lucia explained. "They want to feature your story as one of the key examples of how one individual's voice can lead to a massive change. They want you to be part of the project." Tasha sat back in her chair, stunned. A book? Her story, published for the world to read? She couldn't believe it. "Are you serious?" she asked, trying to wrap her mind around what Lucia was saying. "I am," Lucia replied. "They believe your story is powerful, and they think you can inspire even more people. This could be a huge opportunity for you, Tasha." Tasha felt a mix of emotions: excitement, disbelief, and even a little fear. She never imagined that something like this would happen. But deep down, she knew that this was just another step in her journey. "I don't know what to say," Tasha said softly. "This is all so overwhelming." "You don't have to say anything yet," Lucia said kindly. "Take some time to think about it. But I think you're ready for this next chapter." As Tasha hung up the phone, she sat in silence for a moment, letting the news sink in. She had come so far from the person she had been when she first started working at the Golden Fork. She had been quiet, reserved, and unsure of herself. But now, she was becoming a voice for change, a symbol of what it meant to stand up against injustice and fight for what was right. The road ahead was still uncertain, But Tasha had never been more sure of her purpose. She had made a difference, not just in her own life, but in the lives of countless others who had been made to feel small, insignificant, or invisible. And as she prepared to take on this new opportunity, Tasha knew one thing for sure: she was just getting started.